Hi guys, and welcome back to another story time. We have an absolutely fantastic story this week from Artyom. This was sent to me on the WildStar roleplay forums, and it's on Tumblr. I'll post the link in the description below, and it is absolutely something special. This story blew my mind when I read it. It is a long one, so this is going to be a slightly longer episode than usual, but please do sit back, chill out and enjoy it. It is really worth a listen, and it's worth you guys reading as well. So as I say, link in the description, and I'll crack on with the story very, very quickly. My Name is Not Scanbot by Artyom. Artyom wasn't the most pleasant person to be around. He had a stare that could surely freeze hell 100 times over just by narrowing his brows, a voice that could cause machines to reel back in agony, and a temper that would counter even the shortest of fuses, a ticking time bomb capable of mass destruction, and that was only pre-contagion. Now, if anything, had escalated to something a lot worse. After spending the night in the crypt of his cryopod, all matter of Vitalis drained and flooded into his canisters, the fiery red-headed Mordesh opened his eyes as his body began to respond, metal creaking with the slow turn of his head as he stretched, followed by rolling his shoulders and raising his arms as he held onto the two handles either side of his cryopod. Waiting patiently for the rest of him to attach itself, he gave a sudden jolt and a muffled grunt as the replacement parts for his leg were jammed into the knee, latching itself firmly around the metal cap, and only once attached did the assisting robotics give a low sigh as the hydraulics activated, leaving him to walk off and out of his cryopod to get dressed. They were a gift from Nexus to him, presented by the minefield deep in the Malgrave Trail. "Scanbot," Artyom called sharply once he had donned his medical uniform, which was just as daunting as he was, with the flurry of bloodstains down the front of the apron. Most medics would have gotten a cleaner set, but for some reason he preferred to hold on to this one. He held a liking to its surface, showing the true grit and work of a doctor rather than hiding it all up with a clean, spotless tunic. It also added to his unsettling name in the field, Dr. Payne as they called him. After some time, Artyom noticed that despite being called, the little robot had not turned up. "Scanbot!" the Mordish screamed, this time more urgently. He was about to go and search for the little droid, but was interrupted as he turned to find the Scanbot extremely close to his face, ready for instruction. Despite the Scanbot's lack of punctuality, she was a very handy assistant and was one of the few machines that did not disappoint him entirely. She had saved his life on more than one occasion, so Artyom chose to keep her around, even so much so as fine-tuning her voice to something a little more personified. "Sorry, sir, I did not mean to scare you after you called me," the little bot chirped, her antenna wavering around nervously while her front clasps pushed together for forgiveness. "You are scheduled for 3 patients this morning, the first starting in 30 minutes, she reported, a cascade of numbers and words tumbling down her front screen as she displayed his morning routine for this particular day, all sorted out in time, numeral and alphabetical order. She was such a loyal little robot, some would think it was her programming, but of the amount of care that she offered to the Mordesh, Artyom could say different, even if she was mildly annoying most of the time. "And the rest of the afternoon?" He seemed to have calmed down a little, though the scowl of his unforgivable thick brow remained. The little bot searched through her database, pulling up the remainder of his day, which looked quite bleak compared to the morning. "Nothing new, sir. Would you have me arrange an autopsy for you for the afternoon?" she asked him, a question mark blinking on her surface face as she waited for his response. The offer was tempting, as he could riddle the body later with explosives and send it back to the front, something he could do with relative ease and smuggle it out on the fact it was experimental science, if anyone asked him, but today he thought he should keep his schedule clear in case he was called to do something else again. "No, but make room for Thursday. There's a new shipment of tools I wish to try out. If the neophytes don't break them first," he grumbled between clenched teeth, making his way out of his room after he allowed his Scanbot to fix his collar. Following him out, the Scanbot kept up with his evenly paced strides, though divulged on the possibility of asking him something. She was but a humble robot, an altered assistant with an AI personality, so after much deliberation she proceeded with her question. "Sir, would it be possible to use my given name instead of Scanbot?" she asked him meekly, hovering close when Artyom turned his head. She rarely asked him anything, if at all, to hear her give her opinion. Well, in regards to any android, it was unheard of. "What?" Artyom flatly responded, more a statement of annoyance than an actual question, but nonetheless the brave little robot proceeded. "My given name, sir. Zoe, sir. She sighed, longing for the day to hear the name from her owner's mouth. Your name is Scanbot. You do not have any other name. He made it very clear that he would not call her anything other than what she had come with, Scanbot, and a deep frown on his face made it clear that he didn't want to be asked it again, so she accepted this regretfully and moved on. With that said and done, Artyom's morning was not off to a great start. He made his way into the alchemist's maze, though the barbed wire streets paved with loose stone and rubble, and down the stairs with his ever-faithful Scanbot floating valiantly behind. It was a bit of a slow morning for everyone, the generators that powered most contraptions and experiments in the maze only just humming to life, those which had not run all night anyway. It provided the air with a soothing yet invasively piercing tremble, which only a Mordesh would find peaceful. After arriving at the tents which lined the academy corner, Artyom moved swiftly to his workbench and began to pull out his tools, his Scanbot searching for the rest of his uniform, which involved a mask over his jaw and nose. She darted every which way trying to find it, spying it sitting next to a large jar of miscellaneous body parts, and despite wanting to ask what they were, she decided against it for the greater good. When she hovered back over, the doctor had gathered what he needed today on a clean white cloth, lined up by size and importance. Amongst these many tools were a set of forceps, ranging from something you'd find in a textbook to something you'd only hear of in a horror story. 5 different scalpels, made so sharp it could cut a strand of hair all the way down without fraying, 2 pairs of scissors, a spanner, and a laser saw, so intimidating it looked like the sorts used to cut down trees. She beeped at him politely to turn to her attention. When he did so, she administrated the mask to his face and pulled the back over behind his hair, resting above his ears, which fastened it tightly to his skull. All appropriate accessories are installed, sir, she reported, a whistle of her engines as she flew over to her next task. His first patient was an older exile human, with straggly grey hair, who had a nasty gash on the side of his leg, bound with old pieces of cloth that looked like they came from a stained singlet. It was not the preferred method of preserving what was left of the limb, but that was for Artyom to worry about, not him. With a sickening snort at the back of his throat, the man seated himself on the bench opposite to Artyom's working one, and spat off to his left into the dust, his hands clenching the edge of the table, and after getting comfortable he noticed the Mordesh enter by the tent door. Instantly the human was repelled by the doctor, starting to hop off the bench with a limp in his leg. "I ain't getting fixed by no cripple," he announced with a sharp spit of his lips, rudely and without masking any of his thoughts of Artyom or his prosthetic legs. For the first few moments Artyom stood there in shock, this scumbag excuse of a human making it very clear about his feelings for himself and his limbs. This sort of thing wasn't uncommon to the doctor. He, amongst many others, had felt the keen sting of those who knew nothing about what it was like, who could not understand the concept of something different. Ignorance fueled the fire of hatred, and inability to see past one's own experiences when it came to others, often resulting in such harsh, hurtful words, such as the ones from the greasy exile human. "What?" Artyom's voice jittered, cables grating against his throat. The Mordesh creased his brow in offence, cursing inwards that he could not lash out at this man, but growled his question through his clenched teeth as he made his way over to his patient, with clear, intimidating footsteps that meant malevolence. "You heard me. I ain't having some dead space zombie touching me," the man exclaimed back, now standing upright with as much authority as he wanted. He was soon overshadowed by the looming figure that was Artyom. There was little that matched the height of the Mordesh, even more so their gloomy, almost cynical expression on life. It wasn't apparent to the man that he had crossed a very fine line with the Mordesh. The concept completely passed over him in refusal to acknowledge it. Once Artyom had closed the gap between his patient, he began what was the first in a long saga of explosive responses. "You know, I think I've found a diagnosis for your problem," Artyom started, advancing quickly, which forced the older man to plop back onto the bench, immune to the stench of alcohol, decay, and lack of bathing that this exile gave off. The Mordesh grabbed his wrist with a snap, quick movement, and took a look at it, twisting it around gently. "It seems to me that you have a rather nasty primitive contamination inside your skull. The symptoms include pig-headedness, a greatly reduced brain capacity compared to the standard human. I do detect that there may also be traces of a low intelligence." Letting go of the man's wrist with a quick flip, Artyom lurched back upright and headed back over to his desk. "I'll have to send for another doctor, I suppose. There's nothing I can do for you." The greasy male grinned a toothy smile of success, thinking that his complaining had forced the man to get him a proper exile doctor, but just as he got comfortable again, his face warped into something horrified as he saw Artyom come back with the laser saw, giving it a good pull which started the high-pitched whine of the plasma. "So I'll have to remove that contamination of yours," Artyom concluded bluntly, advancing on the man, who by this time was screaming horribly in terror, shielding his arms over his cowardly face. Unfortunately for the exile, his surgery was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps and an intrusion by a large Granok mercenary. Of course, Artyom stopped his pace, but the saw kept running, turning his head to address the other, while the exile had to deal with the blade inches from his face, so close that he was temporarily deafened by the murderous motor. "What is it? I'm busy!" Artyom snapped at the Granok, a sigh of irritation escaping his chest, and stared flatly at the Granok while they composed themselves after walking in unannounced. He hated being interrupted during his work. The Granok hesitated for a moment, still trying to come to terms with what was happening here, but after shaking their head they delivered their message. "Dr. Payne, you are needed on front. Sergeant's orders." She recited more so, blurting it out of mild concern before she glanced at the exile human, who pleaded silently for assistance, but otherwise kept her attention on Artyom. To the Mordesh that was a bit of a drawback, but after thinking on this he stood up with his saw and placed hands on hip and staring at his patient. "Fortunately for you, it looks like you lived to see another day," he concluded, his voice dripping with disdain. Orders were orders, and if he was needed on front then he had no choice but to go. Before he put away his tools he took a sharp breath inwards and stared the man in the eye. "Now get out!" he bellowed at the human, the strain of his vocal cords distorting into something of nightmares. Without hesitation and with some tripping over his own feet, the old man gladly did. With that irritation marking his morning, Artyom was fuming by the time he reached the docking station, all the soldiers having boarded their helicopters and were ready for takeoff, some already in the air. The sergeant was a colossal Granok woman, 2 humans tall and 3 humans wide. She looked angry, powerful enough to crush a man's skull between her hands, and determined to make sure that everyone she had under her command followed her command. "Move your asses! I wanted that medic on the chopper 5 minutes ago!" The sergeant roared urgently as Artyom hopped up onto the door of the vehicle and grabbed the handlebar for balance, almost immediately taking off as he did so and sailing over Thade's front wall. A low sweep of the ground skimmed the grass before the chopper took a sharp swing to its left, revealing before the Mordesh the rolling hills of Galaras. The front ravaged by Dominion advance, trenches and the echo of plasma cannon fire wailing across the sky. It was an endless sea of smouldering mine holes, scorch marks from gunfire either side of the area, and tracks from the Dominion hover tanks burnt into the once green grass. It looked like a death wish, a disaster waiting to happen setting foot out there, which was why Artyom and many others flew in by aerial assault. Hovering over the landing point, the medic was given the command to disembark. With his resonators on his belt and supplies on his back, Artyom leapt from his chopper and made his rapid descent to the ground. A missile of red hair headed towards the ground with incredible speed. Ahead of him approached plasma fire from a wall of mounted trench gun. He rolled hard mid-flight to avoid the barrage of bullets, pushing his arms tightly as he neared the ground. The Mordesh was unstoppable, hydraulics screaming as he readied himself for impact, guiding him down. Nothing was going to prevent him from touching down, and with a sharp twist of his torso he landed feet first, paired with a loud pulse that scattered the rock and rubble a few metres around his position. A loud static groan of the shocks behind his ankles gave out. His pistons seethed and exhaled before he advanced forwards. With muffled explosions around and behind him, Artyom set to work. Out here was a whole other world. Instead of seeing it from behind the safety of the wall, out here it left a lingering murmur in your chest, only describable as the impending doom that was in the near future if you did not watch your step, misplaced a swing of your weapon, even by the slightest margin, or lost your head to the madness around you. It was easy to become engaged in a way, even more so to lose yourself in it. The Mordesh began his course northward, steamrolling through and over anyone that would cut him down. He took out a Draken with the swing of his elbow, and a Chewer's advance under his feet simply by the speed at which he ran. Faster and faster, weaving through the dead to get to the injured, sending them back to the medics at home should they be wounded too gravely with the aid of a makeshift teleporter. His rage fueled his fire. No matter how bad the injury, no matter how lost the cause, he kept to his job and he challenged the odds, conquering and coming out with unbelievable results. He came to the centre of all the chaos, where barely heard over the war cries and ripples of damage and debris, a small voice came from a pile of rubble close to his feet. "Help me! Help me!" it cried out, drawing the Mordesh's attention almost immediately. Artyom set to work removing what he could without damaging the person beneath any further, unconsciously acting out on this decision to save what he could. "Save me from the bad robot," the voice called again, now visible under a cleared patch of wood and rock. He discovered it was a small child trapped in an air bubble that the debris over their head had created. "A robot?" Artyom repeated, making sure that he heard correctly when he felt a sudden sting graze his arm, sending flecks of flesh in the air as he cupped his hand over his injury with a pained shout. Looking in the direction of the shot, he saw the robot that the child was warning him about, a Makari, one of the Dominion's most deadly units of combat, dressed in glittering gold, red and whites, held a pistol in their clenched hand, fresh smoke drifting from the muzzle before it shifted back into their arm. This Makari began to march forward, shoulders atilt with their strides, perfectly timed to rotate with their hips. These were machines of war, bodies that were capable of incredible intelligence and responsible for the most gruesome of deaths, if worse, interrogations. "Oh, great!" Artyom winced with anger, scrambling to his feet with a light stagger. His arm ached from the shot and was now burdened with not only protecting but saving this little child. He was in no mood for any slip-ups. The Makari looked directly at the small being in the rubble cage, then back to Artyom. A tilt of his head and the quiet click of its focal camera eyes decided its verdict. Obstruction of primary target. Its droning speech box tortured Artyom's ears. New target initiated. Artyom was now its primary focus, which was good news for the little child, but terrible for him. News only went from bad to worse as the Makari's arms raised up and over its shoulder, grabbing something that protruded from its back and pulled it up over, a power blade with plasma as hot as solar flare. One slice from that would surely cleave a person in two. Gripping the handle firmly, the Makari held it towards the Mordesh in one swift motion, only to crouch down as it prepared its forward assault. Artyom took a deep breath and brought his hands to his resonators either side of his hips, clutching each one in hand and brought them to face the warrior of steel, never breaking eye contact as he hit a switch, powering them with a growing, glowing light that radiated outwards until it reached the edges of the panels. It felt like time had slowed down to a stop when the Makari charged towards Artyom, the Mordesh preparing for the worst as he started to spring forward in the same moment. The gap closed slowly at first as Artyom looked for an opening, minding the power sword that was already in mid-swing by the time that time began to fast forward. The Mordesh, with the rapid pushes of the pistons in his legs, shot up and over the Makari, leaving the robot to swing at the open air with a loud buzz from the sword, but was not in vain, as when Artyom turned to attack, the warrior grabbed his leg and threw him to the side against a broken door frame, dispersing into dust the moment the doctor came into contact. Artyom cried in agony, but refused to stay down after such a blow. There were lives on the line. Getting to his knees, he took hold of his resonators and stood shaking the dust from his hair and moved again as the Makari had begun another assault while he was recovering. Barely having time to dodge a frontal skewer, which then got jammed in the rock behind. Covered in splinters at this point, Artyom started to wonder if there was a way to beat this robot, who moved at the speed of light and swung even quicker. He looked for another opening, but had very little time to search, for the Makari had pulled out its sword and was already turning towards him. The swing was brutal, grazing the bridge of Artyom's nose by slicing off a portion of his hair, leaving the red fibres to float down before his very eyes and a small gash just to be sure. The Mordesh was too slow to avoid a direct kick from the robot, straight into the chest and sending him skidding back into another pile of rubble, now trapped between supporting a heavy slab of wood in his shoulders and the ground. The Makari took the time to appreciate the position that Artyom was in, giving that what almost sounded like a laugh from its vocal box, which provoked the ire of the medic quite easily. "What?" Artyom screeched with rage. His fury, he dragged himself up a few more inches to look the machine in the eye. "You come over here and laugh at me, rust bucket!" He enticed the Makari to come a little closer, blowing what hair he had left on his front out of his eyes. "You sack of bulk scrap metal!" The Macquarie focused on the Mordesh, uncomfortably silent before its focal camera shuttered for a second time. Calibrating insult, anger levels elevated. Raising its blade, the robot started to walk over to Artyom. The angry doctor had provoked the rage of a war machine, but it had slowed down enough for him to do something. The Macquarie swung point blank towards Artyom's head, and just before contact with the blade, the Mordesh delivered a hidden punch that rang the loud toll of metal and fist. Pieces of shrapnel scattered and exploded from the Macquarie's face, combining with an awful howling scream from the robot's voice box. It reeled back, head dislodged, but fought on. "Error, error, error," it stammered, its voice looped with disbelief. Although Artyom had successfully landed a hit, which the small child was pleased with, he was still stuck under this piece of wood, which refused to budge no matter how hard he pushed it upwards. He glanced at the Macquarie, who lumbered about, and had an idea. Artyom went to taunt him a second time, but his work was cut out for him. Already the robot took another go at slicing him in half, but with a plan this time. The Mordesh ducked swiftly under the blade's path as the heavy piece of wood was annihilated by plasma. Artyom grabbed his resonators while he was in range. A high-pitched whine from the panels alerted the Macquarie that he had no time to avoid the flashbang of gamma rays, which sent the robot in the opposite direction. It sliced across the ground with a subtle bounce and landed the robot in the same pile of rubble he had previously put Artyom in. Finally pleased with something he had done today, Artyom suffered the consequences of his punch as he dropped the resonator and put his hand to his injury again. Having realized that it was on the same arm, he knew it would be difficult to apply the same amount of force needed to dislodge that head, and the more he scavenged for a solution, the less he could find. A moment of light shone in the darkness as he heard the familiar whir of gears behind him, turning to find that his ever-faithful Scanbot had come for him. "Sir, I have found you!" she squealed happily. A collection of pixels on her face formed a happy expression as she buzzed closer to him. It was almost inspiring to consider the level of danger she went through for his needs. She was that last thing he expected out here, and with the Macquarie still rebooting, Artyom had time to get his rescue mission done. As the Mordesh hurried over to the rubble pit again, his Scanbot noticed the injury preventing him from lifting up any of the heavier bits that would set this trapped child free. He shouted in frustration with a hand to his forehead, blaming his own carelessness for this, not focusing on everything around him rather than just the one object. "You have minor muscular injury, sir. Please do not lift heavy objects," the ever-helpful Scanbot chirped, as if Artyom wasn't aware of it in the first place. She then whisked herself to his side and opened a hidden compartment from her front, pulling out a small bandage and a few staples. With the precision of a bomb scrambler, she pulled the injury closed with the staples and gently sheltered them under the bandage wrap, finishing with a tidy knot when she was done. "Damage temporarily apprehended, sir. Medical attention is advised. Would you have me book yourself in with yourself?" Putting away her tools, she and the Mordesh heard the tumble of wood and metal as the opponent rebooted, standing up like nothing had ever happened, save for its surface was now just as dusty as Artyom's. The Dominion was just as determined as Artyom was, but with his arm out of action he was left with one resonator, and that would not bring down this Macquarie. Or would it? Artyom's eyes darted all over the place as they looked for an opening, finally spotting it at the base of the Macquarie's head. A single strong hit to that would surely decapitate it, but by the looks of it, it would take a tremendous amount of strength to do it. Not even Artyom's resonator could keep it down. "Scanbot," he addressed his assistant, but his eyes remained fixed on the Macquarie. "Clear out the rubble from that pile. There is a small child in there. Do not let any of it cave in." Artyom had an idea, but it required his Scanbot to attend to the patient while it was carried out. The only thing here that was strong enough to separate that head from the Macquarie was the Macquarie themselves. Despite being battered and partly broken, this robot was in better condition than Artyom was. The only thing in Artyom's favour was that the power sword was no longer useful, lying dented and flickering on the ground from the previous attack. A long crack ran up its blade. The Macquarie couldn't attack him with quick, direct swings, however. This did not faze it from destroying the Mordesh. Rolling its shoulder, the robot took a moment to register a new directory path in order to complete its task. It raised arm and pointed a clenched fist at Artyom. The arm began to take a new shape, slivers of metal folding back and rotating around until a small plasma cannon sat in its place. Despite its size and speed, this was a weapon to be feared. Its power level was staggering, the force of 1,000 suns in each blast, and there was likely no chance of survival if he suffered a direct hit. Faced with this powerful yet avoidable death, Artyom put his plan into action. Under each metal foot a set of wheels revealed themselves after he took a moment to lift each limb off the ground. The small child that was trapped under the rubble, now being patiently cleared out by Zoe, looked at Artyom's feet with awe. What they had just seen was every kid's dream, so they found his limbs extremely inspiring. Resonator in hand, the medic began to run forward, turning into a sharp skate which immediately improved his speed. Blazing along the ground, the Mordesh narrowly avoided the first of many shots from the cannon and took a hard right around the Makari. As expected, the Makari's central turret rotated, following the medic around and around. Artyom knew now that the Makari was locked on completely. Deterring him from the Mordesh was impossible. Escalating in speed, the Mordesh ran circles, only just missing fire which grazed past the tip of his nose. The intense heat from the ball of plasma passing by and reminding him that this Makari, as slow as it now was, retained its pinpoint aim. The Scanbot managed to push away the crucial pieces that were on verge of collapse, hovering around to the back where she pulled out the small boulders that blocked any escape. "Is he a robot too?" the little child asked in admiration, pointing over to Artyom, who was no more than a red and blur circle around the spinning Makari. "Dr. Payne is a sentient organism," she replied in all honesty, pulling out a piece of wood that allowed the child room to crawl out safely. "Only his legs are a robot." Taking them by the hand, the little Scanbot led the child away from the battle and to a patch of grass leading out from the field. "My master needs me now. I must go to him." She nodded as much as a robot could and gently patted the child's face with her antenna. But before she could even hover away, two tiny arms held her flipper panel and embraced her in a hug. "Thank you," the child cried, giving the Scanbot a kiss on her cheek before they hurried off to safety. Watching them run away, the small android put her flipper to the side of her front panel. This was what she longed for from her owner, the simplest of gratitude. He'd never admit it, but as much as she needed him, he needed her. She heard Artyom yell out behind her. His circling idea had reached its end as he was tripped up by the irritated Makari, who had their cannon pointed right between the doctor's eyes. A mad little buzz emitted from the Scanbot as she flew quickly over to assist. As long as she was around, there was nobody that could hurt Artyom. Partly sprawled back on a rock, the Mordesh sat up and met the cannon to his forehead. The spinning had done more damage to him than it had the Makari, which left him with a regretful taste of dirt in his mouth. He didn't go through an entire minefield to die at the hands of Makari. Not now. His thoughts were cut short as the warrior grabbed him by the throat, squeezing just hard enough to hear the scrape of metal, and lifted him up to eye level. A cold stare on his face, Artyom refused to give the Makari any satisfaction through his death. There were so many terrible things going on around him, and even before he had arrived on Nexus, that now everything seemed insignificant. The Makari tilted its head, its camera shutters clicking for the last time as it made its assessment. "Subject contained. Target level of fear is lacking. Why do you not scream?" it asked, as if it seemed to care what Artyom felt. Whatever it was going to mock him about next trailed to a low moan. The lights of its eyes flickered out as sparks came from its neck. A short delay and the machine's head tumbled from its post. Artyom hung there perplexed, looking up when a familiar voice box spoke. "Because he is brave." The Scanbot held a cable in her prongs, which had come from the Makari's framework that powered its head from the neck. Artyom stared at the little bot. There was little that could put any other expression other than a disgruntled furrow on his brow, but he was stunned that he had escaped with his life intact, but even more so that she had come back for him. She hovered there before him, dropping the cable and holding her prongs together. "Sir, assistance is recommended when fighting an enemy." She came over to the Makari's hand holding Artyom's neck, slicing through the robotic fingers which released the Mordesh from his suspended prison. He rubbed his throat, gave a brief cough and breathed in deeply. This was one of her closer saves, but it was added to the infinite tally that she likely kept a record of. "Thank you, Scan." He thanked her hoarsely, but paused halfway as he thought of a better way to address her. "Zoe?" At first she prepared a pre-recorded response that all Scanbots carried, but hearing her name said properly was a pleasant surprise for the giddy little bot. who spun around with a shrill squeal of machinery and as much happiness as an AI programming could allow. "You said my name, sir!" she cried out, almost short-circuiting from the excitement, but came to rest in Artyom's hands. If the little machine could cry, she would have spent the next few moments sobbing into his arms. Okay guys, thank you very much for listening to this short story by Artyom. As I said, he sent it to me on the WildStar Roleplay forums. Go and check out some more stories on there. They are absolutely fantastic, and this has been one of my favourites so far. Thank you very much, Artyom, for sending this to me for me to read out. I hope I've done it justice for you. And if anyone else would like their story read out, get them sent in. You can send them to me on the official WildStar forums, you can send them to me on Twitter, you can send them to me on Facebook, and you can email me. All the links are in the description below. Get your stories in, and let's share some story time with more people out there. And if you did like this video, please do hit the like button, share it with your friends, and why not subscribe to my channel, because it is completely free, and everyone loves a good bit of story time and games just as much. So thank you very much, guys. I will see you next time.